Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. This morning we'll be doing another sutta study. Today looking at one section from a sutta in the Sutta-Nipata. So we can begin by paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So this morning we're looking at a section from the Sabhiya Sutta, so from the Sutta-Nipata chapter 3, Sutta number 6. So this discourse takes the form of a wanderer coming and asking the Buddha a series of questions. And he has started by asking several of the other spiritual teachers at the time, and he was not satisfied with their answers or lack of answers. So eventually he goes to see the Buddha and he asks a series of questions, and the Buddha gives some very profound answers. So here we'll be, again, jumping directly to one section, which was specifically requested by one of the residents here at the monastery. So if one is looking at the Bhikkhu Bodhi translation, this is verse 528 that we're starting at. If one is looking at the Burmese Chattasangayana edition, the Sixth Council edition, then it's verse 533. So again, the numbering in different editions of the canon is sometimes slightly different, but that's not what's important. What's important is the content. So in this section here, it's starting with the question from the wanderer Sabiya, and then after that is the Buddha's answer. So Sabiya asks, King Patamahu vedagu anuviditang kena katancha virya vati ajanyo kinti nama hoti puttome bhagavabhya karohi. So his question is, he says, King Patamang ahu vedagu. So having attained what? So pati means to attain or to reach. So having attained what is one called vedagu. So vedagu is from the word veda. So veda just means knowledge. So from the root vid, which means to find out. It's the same root from which we get the word vidya, which means knowledge or understanding. So Veda means a body of knowledge, a body of information. And the suffix gu, it actually comes from the same root from which we get the word gacchati, which means to go. So vedagu means one who has arrived at knowledge. And this appears to have been a commonly used term in the time of the Buddha to mean somebody who is very knowledgeable. And it was particularly used by Brahmins to mean somebody who was well versed in the Vedas, someone who had a good knowledge of the Brahmanic scriptures, such as they were at that time in ancient India. They were not yet fully formed as we know them these days, but there was still a body of Brahmanic scriptural knowledge contained in texts called Vedas, the bodies of knowledge. And one who was well versed in that could be called a vedagu. So the word vedagu sometimes gets translated as scholar, but it needs to be understood that what vedagu means is, again, one who has attained to knowledge, one who has arrived at knowledge. And again, recognizing that this is from the same root as vidya. And in the Buddhist texts, vidya is almost synonymous with panya. So vidya is referring to the profound wisdom, the profound understanding that comes through following the Buddhist path. So vijja is sometimes translated as true knowledge or true understanding, to distinguish that this is not knowledge of mundane things. It's not knowledge of the length of a football field or how many ants can fit on a cushion or something like that. It's knowledge of liberation. It's knowledge of awakening. So carrying on with this, so he says, attained what is one called the knowledge master, one who has arrived at truth, arrived at wisdom, arrived at knowledge. Anaveditang kena katancha viryavati. So anaveditang means to thoroughly understand something. So anaveditang kena katancha. So by means of thoroughly understanding what, how is one called viryavati? So viryavati means one who has virya. Virya we normally translate as energy. And this is understood to be the energy that we apply in our practice, the heroic effort to retrain the mind, to transform the mind from that of a ordinary, greedy, aversive, delusional, unawakened being, into the completely pure mind of an awakened being. So it's this energy that we apply to overcome the unwholesome and to cultivate the wholesome. And it's interesting here, he's saying, having understood what is one energetic. So it's pointing to this idea that the energy that one has in one's practice is based again on knowledge. And if one is particularly sharp with language, you might also note that the word anuviditang comes from that same root vid. So anu, the prefix anu, means according to or along with or thoroughly. And vid, this root vid, again means to know or to seek. So anuviditang means to thoroughly know. So having thoroughly known what is one viryava, someone who has energy. And he then says, ajanyo kinti nama hoti. And he says, and what's how is one called a ajanya? So the term ajanya in the suttas, it normally refers to the best of horses. And this is a simile that the Buddha uses in many, many places throughout the suttas. So he often analogizes people to horses, which for those who are obsessed with humanity, that might seem a little bit insulting, but actually I think the Buddha was pointing to a very important fact, which is that as much as we like to think of ourselves as intelligent, rational beings, when it comes to training the mind, it's much more like training an animal. So our mind is much more like a wild horse. It's always trying to run all over the place and it doesn't want to do what it's told. And it's only through strict, persistent training that the mind starts to become tamed, starts to become domesticated. So the ajanya, the thoroughbred horse, this is a horse which is the best of the best. So it's one which is not just strong and healthy physically, but it's also exceptionally well trained. It's the kind of horse which does what needs to be done when it needs to be done, which has this capacity to be trained, this capacity to be the best of the best. And horses also carry a connotation of nobility, of refinement. And throughout much of human history, to have a thoroughbred horse was associated with the noble classes. So it's also this indication of what it is to be a noble being in Buddhism, which is to be awakened. And he says, Puttome Bhagavan Vyakarohi. So he says, this is what I've asked to let the Blessed One explain this to me. And the Buddha replies. So he has, Vedani vichaya kevalani, samananang yani rati brahmananang, sabha vedanasu vitarago, sabang vedang aticha vedagu. So this is the first part of his answer. He gives his answer in 4 sections. So Vedani Vichaya Kevalani. So Vedani is again, it's saying Vedas, so the bodies of knowledge. Vichaya means to investigate or to analyze. And Kevalani means entirely or thoroughly or all of them. So having thoroughly investigated all the bodies of knowledge, all the Vedas, and samananang yane dati brahmananang. So he's saying whatever there is among the samanas and brahmins. So whatever bodies of knowledge are available among contemplatives and brahmins, so the priests or the ceremonialists. It says sabha vedanasu vitarago. So without one who is without passion or lust towards any vedana, towards any sensation. He says, Sabang Vedang Aticha Vedaguso. He says, so such a person has transcended all the Vedas, or has transcended the entire body of knowledge. So here, it actually looks like the Buddha is making a bit of a word play. So between the word Veda and the word Vedana. So the word Veda, again, means a body of knowledge, body of spiritual information. Whereas Vedana is referring to the sensations that we have of pleasure, pain, and neither pleasure nor pain. So these 3 basic kinds of reactive tones that accompany any sensory experience. So any sensory experience is accompanied by the Vedana of pleasure, the Vedana of pain, or the Vedana of neither pain nor pleasure. And so here the Buddha is saying, well, you thoroughly examine all of the Vedas to the point where you are free of lust towards any Vedana. And then you can be called someone who has transcended the Vedas. And so this is what, again, he's saying this is what actually means somebody who is a scholar, somebody who knows the bodies of spiritual knowledge. He's saying that ultimately it comes through directly understanding one's own experience, directly understanding one's own Vedana. So observing pleasure, pain, and neutral sensation. So these 3 basic things. He says this is what it actually means to be a master of Veda. So it's directly knowing Vedana and being free of lust for Vedana. This is what makes one a master of the Vedas. So this is another characteristic of the Buddha's teachings, is that he would often take the spiritual terminology of other traditions at the time, and then he would use word plays or linguistic tricks in order to turn it around and make it into a Buddhist concept. Then next he says, Anuvicha papancha nama rupang ajatang bahidacha rogamulang sabaroga mula bandhana pamuto anuvidito tadi pavucha te tatata. So anuvicha papancha nama rupang. So anuvicha again means to thoroughly investigate or analyze. Papancha nama rupa. This word compound it's made up of papancha, which means proliferation or mental complication. So papancha is the process of constantly spinning increasingly complicated mental activities and formations and ideas and thoughts and all of this. So this constant building up of a mental complexity around something. And for those who are interested in papancha, flagship sutta on this is the Madhupindika Sutta, the Honeyball Sutta, so Majjhima Nikaya 21, if I recall correctly, which goes into great detail on how papancha begins. So he's saying, having completely understood papancha nama rupa. So nama rupa means mind and body. So papancha nama rupa. So with word compounds in Pali, the relationship between the different words in the compound is not explicit. It's always implicit. And sometimes there's multiple possible ways of interpreting the relationship between words in a Pali word compound. So when I say papancha nama rupa, my first thought would be proliferation based upon body and mind. Based upon whatever kind of physical or mental experience we're currently having, then we produce papancha, we produce mental proliferation. We generate these overly complex and complicated messes in our mind. So the Buddha is saying, completely understanding this process, completely understanding the formation of mental complexity, of complication and proliferation in the mind based upon namarupa, based upon the experience of body and mind. He says, ajatang bahidata rogamulang. He says, this is the root of illness, both internal and external. So the root of illness here seems to be, he's referring to papancha. So papancha as being the process of adding layers of complexity to our experience. This also builds upon his statement in the previous paragraph where he's saying, well, if you want to really understand the Vedas, then you should understand Vedana. So the Vedas is being this massive, incredibly complicated corpus of information. And Vedana, on the other hand, being this very direct, simple, straightforward, down-to-earth experience that's happening in every single moment. So the Buddha is saying, if you really want to thoroughly understand this vast body of spiritual knowledge, well, then you need to clearly examine the most simple and basic element of our experience. So similarly, in this next section here, he's saying, so thoroughly examining mental complication, how we form this excessive proliferation based on our body and mind. You can see this is actually the root of all of our disease. It's the root of all of our affliction. It's this tendency to take what's very simple, so seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and cognizing. So we take this very simple, direct sensory experience, and then we layer onto that so much unnecessary complication. And that's what causes our affliction. It's not the body-mind itself, but it's the layers of proliferation and complication that we pile on top of body-mind. And he says, Sabaroga mula bandhana pamutto, so being liberated from the bondage of the root of all illness. So here again, he's talking about being free from papancha, free from this mental complication that we normally pile on our experience. It says, anuvedito tadi pavuchate tatata. So anuvedito again means having thoroughly understood, so thoroughly known. So anuvedito tadi, so such a being is one who is thoroughly known and can be called such. Then he continues. He says, "Virato ida sabapapakehi." So being dispassionate towards all that is evil, all that is harmful. Nirya dukkang aticca virya vaso. So he's saying that the energetic person has transcended the suffering of the hell realms. So again, he's pointing to something, again, very direct. He's saying, well, just pay attention right now in this moment right here, if anything harmful is arising, if anything harmful or evil is present, then to have dispassion towards that. It's like, I don't want to get involved in that. I'm not interested in participating in anything harmful. And he's saying, in so doing, then one immediately transcends the suffering of the hell realms. So this is also pointing to the fact that we can experience hell-like suffering in this very moment, in this very life. Whenever we engage in anything harmful or unwholesome, then we're already immersed in the suffering of the hell realms. And similarly, in order to be free of the suffering of the hell realms, well, then just don't generate the karma that leads one to rebirth in hell. It's actually, the Buddhist teachings are actually remarkably straightforward on this. Like, you don't want to go to hell? Well, then don't make the karma that leads to hell. Just don't walk down that path, and then you don't have anything to worry about. Don't do anything evil, and you won't wind up in hell. It's actually really, really straightforward. And then he says, so viryava padanava diro tadi pavuchate tatata. And he says, so the person who is energetic, who is full of striving, who is steadfast, such a one can be called in this way. So here he's talking about the energetic one is the one who is making the effort to be dispassionate towards all harmful activities, towards all that is evil, all that is unwholesome. Then the last line here of his verse, this is more just a summary of what he was saying before. He says, Yasasu unani bandhanani ajatang bahidacha sangamulang sabasangamula bandhana pamuto ajanyo tadi pavuchate tatata. So he's saying one who has cut their bonds, cut their attachments, both internally and externally. They've severed the root of bondage, the root of imprisonment. Being liberated from the root of all bondage, of all imprisonment, then such a one can be called the thoroughbred, the best or the noblest of beings. So here he's talking simply directly about the cultivation of non-attachment, of not being bound to anything, not being stuck on anything, not settling on anything in particular. So that's the end of the section that we're looking at this morning. So again, this is just one piece of the Sabhiya Sutta, but if I were to go through the whole Sabhiya Sutta, we would probably need about 2 or 3 hours at least. But that's this particular section. So at this time, we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And if there's any questions, I can take questions. So first, hello to all the people joining in online. So hello to Rick, Vivian, Jayanta, John, Gayatri, Douglas, Bhumika, Vidura, Elenisa, Usha, Kumu, Morgana, Richard, Patty, Melissa, Avi, Christina and Edward, and Victoria. Hello to all of you. And I don't see any questions online. Any questions from here? Yeah, go ahead.
So in terms of avoiding hell realms, if one has committed an act in the past, one transcends that act by abandoning the action, so taking the precepts and eroding that mental, physical, bodily fabrication that will lead to hell. Is that how that works?
So basically, well, the Buddha is pointing to here, actually I think his main point here is that the participation in any kind of unwholesome activity immediately generates nirya dukkha. So right in that moment, you're getting a little taste of hell. So then if one doesn't do anything harmful or unwholesome, then one is not experiencing nirya dukkha in that moment. So as for future rebirth, well, I mean, the more you cultivate good karma and the less you cultivate bad karma, then the less likely you are to be reborn in a hell realm. But I think the Buddha's main point here is actually referring to the immediate present moment. So every moment in which we refrain from unwholesome, harmful activity of body, speech, and mind, that's a moment when we are avoiding nirya dukkha, so the suffering of the hell realms. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, of course, it also applies to future lives. But in this discourse, I think his main point is about the immediate present. There's a question here from Elenisa. So Elenisa asks, how do we differentiate between a complicated pattern of thoughts over experiences and an investigative, analytical pattern to understand the experience? It's a good question. So the main thing to look at is the effects on the mind. So if one is applying analytical wisdom, then the effect on the mind is an increase in serenity, an increase in equanimity, an increase in clarity. The result is the mind being less defiled, less messy, more settled, less prone to defilement. So those are all signs that what you're doing is, as you call it, the investigative analytical pattern to understand the experience. So we're looking at the result. If that's the result you're getting, then that's wholesome. On the other hand, the effect of papancha, so this unnecessary complication of mind, that effect is usually that it makes the mind increasingly messy, agitated, disturbed, unsettled, unclear. It tends to result in just more and more messiness and confusion of mind. It can also result in increasing unwholesome patterns of behavior. But the main immediate noticeable effect is that the mind is increasingly confused and disturbed. Whereas the effect of analytical wisdom is that the mind becomes increasingly peaceful and clear. So again, it's looking at the result, and then you can distinguish the difference. Any other questions? Yeah.
So, on the same section of what you said makes the most practical sense to me. The confusion I had is the order of the compound. It seems like the more what it should be, it would be non-glucose potential the other way, because it seems like papancha is modifying non-rupa rather than non-rupa modifying papancha, and that's what I was confused by. Is the compound ambiguous to the point that it can be read both ways?
Yeah. So the majority of the time, polyword compounds, the final word in the compound is the main word, and all the words before the final word are modifying or describing the final word. Similar to like in English, that's normally how word compounds work. Like blackbird means a bird that is black. The main word here is bird. So it's in most poly compounds, that's how it is. But sometimes it's the other way around. And particularly in Pali poetry, all the rules go out the window because they're trying to mangle things to make them sound more poetic. So Pali poetry, this is one reason why Pali poetry is notoriously difficult to translate, because the normal rules of Pali word structure and sentence structure are often altered or just completely thrown out the window. So you do sometimes encounter in Pali poetry where things seem to be in reverse order from what one would expect. And usually it's to make it fit the meter. So Pali poetry it's all about rhythm and meter, not about rhyme. Like there's no concept of rhyming in Pali poetry. It's all about rhythm and meter. And in order to make things fit the meter, then sometimes you have to reverse the order of words, or you have to abbreviate words, or you have to use very unusual phrasing. And again, this is all part of what makes Pali poetry a bit of a challenge to translate. So, papancha namarupang. Yeah, I can't see any way of taking this other than proliferation based on body and mind. Yeah, I can't see another way of translating that compound. Unless you have some other suggestion on how to take it, but I can't see another way right now.
I think that makes sense. The only only other possibility that I know of is that Yogamulam is in the list, like having a bunch of Namrupam and the root of illness internally and externally, but that's the order is mixed as well. So I don't, because I think they're both in acoustic. Is that they like Papancha Namrupam agrees in Yogamulam, so I think they have to be.
Could also be nominative neuter.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that makes the most sense.
Yeah, I actually think it's nominative neuter. Could be accusative. They take the same suffix. Yeah, I mean, I don't see another way. So just playing with it in my mind. So like roga mula, you can see it's the mula of roga, so the root of disease. But papancha namarupa, the namarupa of papancha, just doesn't really make any sense. Whereas the papancha of namarupa, that makes sense. Yeah. So sometimes, like when dealing with word compounds in Pali, what I'll do is I'll just start listing every possible relationship I can think of between the different components, and you just start, and I'll actually sometimes just say them out loud, and eventually it becomes clear, like one of these makes sense more than the other ones, and that's usually the intended meaning. There's another question here online. So Kumu asks, is there a similarity between this sutta and the Dvaita Vitakka Sutta? Well, actually, to be honest, the Dvaita Vitakka Sutta is basically a concise summary of Buddhist practice. It's, or more precisely, it's a summary of samavayama, of right effort. So that sutta is talking about how whatever we traditionally, or whatever we habitually direct the mind towards becomes the tendency of the mind. And so if we habitually direct the mind towards unwholesome behaviors, then the mind will become increasingly inclined to act in unwholesome ways. But if we repeatedly direct the mind towards wholesome activities, then that will become the habit of the mind, the inclination of the mind. So that's basically all of Buddhism. All of Buddhism is about training the mind to only do what is wholesome. And in particular, training the mind to see the world in terms of anicca, dukkha, anatta, in terms of the Four Noble Truths. So the Dvaita Vitakka Sutta, I wouldn't say that there's a similarity between this sutta and the Dvaita Vitakka Sutta. Rather, I would say that the Dvaita Vitakka Sutta is pointing to an underlying principle that runs throughout all Buddhist practice. And therefore, the Dvaita Vitakka Sutta is related to every other sutta implicitly, which would include this one. Joe, you had a question?
My mind's focusing on this Nirodha Dukkha, about like how to liberate beings from hell. I remember a story about the Buddha. It might be a Jataka tale of that when he was a bodhisattva. It's an image perception of he's in hell. He's in Naraya, and he instead of he's being tortured, but he saves. He says no, like hit me instead of this other person. Like this other person's being tormented, and instead of thinking about himself, he says hurt me instead, and then the demon just kills him, and then he's reborn somewhere else.
Mm.
Implying that the moment he thinks about someone else instead of himself, he's out of hell. And is that a metaphor? Is that a metaphor for how we can practice in the here and now? About when we recognize we're angry, if we apply the antidote, then we're out of hell. We liberate, self-liberate ourselves in that mind moment.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way of relating to it. So whenever we're in any kind of unwholesome state of mind, then that's like being in hell. And the moment we drop that unwholesome state of mind and switch to a wholesome state of mind, then we're free of that hell condition. Yeah.
So we would need mindfulness in order to recognize. So the delusion would be why it's the worst anger, because if we're deluded, we don't know we're angry, then we don't know we're in hell.
Yeah. So when the mind is deluded, then one can repeatedly engage in unwholesome behaviors without even recognizing that that's what one is doing. In fact, one might be doing something unwholesome while thinking it's wholesome. So this is part of why the Buddha said that delusion is the most blameworthy, but also the most difficult to remove. Because one, it's hard to see what we're doing, and two, we tend to just keep doing harmful things over and over again, possibly while thinking it's the right thing to do. Just look up any, just go to any history encyclopedia and type in holy war, and you'll see this.
That's a bit like righteousness.
Yeah, good old righteous anger justifying unwholesome behaviors.
That's delusion.
Yeah. Yeah, where you believe you're doing something good when you're actually doing something bad. Yeah. And there's a question here. So Rick says, how does Veda impact Vedana? Not quite clear what you're meaning here, but if we take Veda in its literal meaning of simply knowledge, so body of knowledge, rather than referring specifically to Brahmin scriptures. So when one has knowledge, so knowledge of the Buddha's teachings, knowledge of the path to awakening, then one's relationship to Vedana shifts, because one recognizes that pleasant Vedana is to be known and not attached to. Unpleasant Vedana is to be known and not aversive towards. And neutral Vedana is to be known with complete clarity. So maintaining alertness and attention. So this is what shifts. So without knowledge of the training of the mind, then we will just automatically tend to cultivate desire and attachment towards pleasant Vedana, to cultivate aversion and repulsion towards unpleasant Vedana, and to cultivate apathy and ignorance towards neutral Vedana. So this is how having spiritual knowledge affects our experience of Vedana. Yeah.
Okay. A follow-up question on that same line. So when it seems like when the Buddha says, having examined all the Vedas or bodies of knowledge that exist among Samanas and Brahmanas, and then he goes into feeling. Do you think that there's something more besides kind of the pun here, that he's saying we should examine our views? I mean, is that kind of what and we should see how our feelings relate to that? Or
I think that's a bit of a stretch from what's written here. And what you're saying is not wrong. I don't think that's what's being said here.
So what would you say is kind of the, I guess, point of examining all the bodies of knowledge among Stoics and Brahmins. I guess that part it seems almost unrelated outside of kind of the pun.
So it also comes down to this word. So vichaya, actually, it appears to be the optative sense. Like one could study all the Vedas. One might study all the Vedas. You could do this if you want to. It's a possibility. But he's saying what really defines a Veda master is somebody who has no lust towards any Vedana. And in this way has transcended all the Vedas. So I'm not sure if that comes through in Bhante Bodhi's translation of this. No, he says having examined, which would be, so the word vichaya, again, that's the standard form of the optative. So one might do this, or one could do this, or one may do this, one can do this. But it can, that particular form can also be, I forget the proper term for it off at the top of my head. Having done something. What's that? Oh, there's a particular polygrammatical term which is slipping my mind right now. It could be that, but that would be an uncommon grammatical form. So that suffix aya, it almost always is used for the optative. Like one might do this, or one could do this. So I think that that's probably actually what the Buddha was saying here. He's saying you could analyze all the Vedas, but to actually be a Veda master means to clearly understand Vedana and not have lust towards Vedana. That's what it means to be a Veda master.
That makes sense, yeah. I think I just, with this, the having part that confused me.
Yeah, this is part of why it's important. If you really want to get into the details of the suttas, you need to learn Pali. Otherwise, details like this will slip right past you. You won't even notice it in the translation. Yeah.
Seems relevant to ask. I mean, this could apply also to the Buddhist texts, to the words of the Buddha. You could memorize every word of the, you could memorize every sutta and know them in and out and know what every word means and still not be enlightened. Is that a relevant application of this teaching?
Yeah, in the Zen tradition, they say a picture of rice does not satisfy hunger. And that's exactly what they're talking about. You could memorize the entire Buddhist canon and not be one step closer to awakening if you're not actually applying any of that to restructuring your mind. Yeah. Okay, anything else? Okay, maybe enough for this morning. So we can go ahead and end this session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.